I am excited to be here today to talk a little bit about myself as well as the work that we do at Creative Reaction Lab, and particularly a framework that we developed called Equity Centered Community Design. And honestly, being intentional and thinking about what are the power that we hold in our community? How do we not just be individuals that are affected by systems of oppression, but how do we actually redesign systems to be more inclusive and equitable and liberatory for each person and not just certain communities? So before I get started and explain more about our process and how we've applied it in a few examples at our organization, I actually want to introduce you to myself. And the easiest way for me to go about that in the moment is I'm going to start with a video that was produced by Ted and Dove. If you cannot hear the sound, please quickly put it in the chat so that I can quickly fix it. But I want to say I did click that you can hear the sound before we get started, okay? And so it's really about being a redesigner for justice and my motivation. And this is important because I believe any spaces that we're in, any areas that we're trying to redesign, we have to center our own living expertise. And we have to understand that that is a superpower and it is not something that needs to be hidden or conformed or put up a mask, but really recognizing the power that we have with our day-to-day expertise and how that actually allows us to show up more authentically and stronger in spaces, okay? And so we're gonna start there and then I'm going to move forward in the presentation. See you in a sec. Design is everything and everywhere. All of our systems, all of our communities, all of our experiences have been by design. And if we are in spaces that don't allow us to authentically show up as our full selves, then create our own spaces. Different folks may give this image that to have confidence, you need permission. Understand that you define your narrative. When I personally say that I am a designer, I think about the creation of continual possibilities, the outcomes that I am affecting every day, the importance of not just focusing on building objects, but also thinking about the systems and how they've been built and designed. I think about media and technology and how some algorithms literally can't even see me as a Black woman. Systems of oppression, inequality, inequity, they are all by design, but that also means they can be redesigned. When many people ask me about the experiences I've had in my life, I don't shy away from it. I'm actually very transparent. 2 years ago, I lost my 14-year-old brother to gun violence. And that was probably the time out of all the things that I've been through where I started to really question my confidence. I started to question, was I effective? Was I enough? And then I recognized that my story wasn't the only. The experiences that I've had has allowed me to leverage the power and access to actually create change. There's so many ways in which we could design spaces to be more inclusive, but that requires us inviting diverse co-creators to be a part of that process. Creative Reaction Lab educates, trains, and challenges Black and Latinx youth to help them understand that they are the equity leaders of today as well as tomorrow. My experiences that I've had, while they have been hard, I view them as catalysts for change. The process of moving through the harm actually allows us to go deeper, to find confidence with a capital C. Your confidence is something that you deserve, and your confidence is something that you control. My living knowledge is my superpower. My armor is built through the lens of legacy building that allows me to show up in spaces that maybe weren't built for me, but I still have a sense of confidence when I'm there because I know that no one can tell me where I belong. I determine that myself. sometimes when I watch that video, I get somewhat teary because this month is obviously May, and May 2nd would have been, well, not would have been, was the 3-year anniversary of my brother's murder, unfortunately. And May 24th would have actually been his 18th birthday. And so when I come into spaces, when I show up for what I do every single day, I am always thinking about the folks that I'm bringing with me and also my purpose. I tell people all the time that I am no longer in a job. I am no longer in a career. I am in a purpose. And that's what I honestly want everyone to strive towards is what is your purpose? What is your why? What is your being? Because when we look at society, there are a lot of inequities. There are a lot of systems of oppression, and it is easy to get overwhelmed with all of the trauma and harm to really paralyze you. And you have to really think about what is the space that I need to show up in where I can effectively do it. And I have that living connection and expertise that I can leverage to actually move the system through that lens versus a lens of paternalism, savior complexity, colonization, and more, right? And so just a little bit more about myself. My name is Antionette, and my personal pronouns are she, her, hers. I will tell you I am very country. So some people say Antoinette, and nobody got time to put the extra accents. It's just Antionette. my husband's, my married name is like Carroll, but I just say Carroll because I'm like, who's doing all that, right? Which probably explains my personality of like getting things done and getting to the point. I am a serial social entrepreneur, having started 5 different businesses, 4 of them still running, and 3 of them I am still actively leading. One of them actually is a foundation in my brother's name called the Oscar Johnson III Youth Hope Foundation. I also am the co-founder and co-director of Redesign, which is an organization that directly works with Black, Latinx, and Indigenous youth that are aspiring creatives that want to really have a stronger path in their creative journey. And then the main business that I'm known for is Creative Reaction Lab, which is an organization where we educate, train, and challenge Black and Latinx youth to become leaders in designing healthy and racially equitable communities. I've had many folks ask me, are you an urban planning studio? Are you architects? Are you social workers? Are you civic engagement practitioners? And I love the assignments that people give us because we work at this, in my mind, more straightforward intersection, but a lot of people view our work as very unique because of the different actors we bring into the space, because the intentionality of our process, and also because we don't believe that there's a one silver bullet solution to address the issue. We're not just looking at policy change. We're not just looking at curriculum design. We're not just looking at a business model. We recognize that interventions take many different shapes and forms, and all of these approaches are drops in a bucket that will get us closer to that world of equity that we actually have yet to attain. And so that feeds how I show up in spaces. I am an equity, diversity, inclusion coach. I am a designer, actually studied and practiced graphic design, having worked in the advertising and marketing industry for almost 10 years. And but now when I tell people designer, I think about it through a different lens, which I'll share in a second. And also I would say that some people call me a super fellow. I call it a don't know how to sleep person or fellow. But the main fellows that people know me for is being a TED fellow, being an Aspen Institute Civil Society fellow, Roddenberry, which if anyone knows Star Trek, Gene Roddenberry, they have a fellowship for civic leaders. And then I'm also an Echoing Green Fellow, which is an organization that supports big, bold ideas in the social enterprise space. And they were the first investors of Public Allies, Teach for America, Girl Trek, et cetera. And so this, how do I put this? The things that I just explained are the professional side, right? What I feel like we don't talk about enough is the personal side. You saw in my video that I'm a mother of Black boys. I'm a wife of a Black man. I am a Black woman myself. I literally grew up in underinvested neighborhoods, and I literally grew up not thinking that I was oppressed because we still had joy. And I want to make sure that when we talk about designing an equitable society, we don't just talk about it through a trauma-based lens, but recognize that there is acts of joy and resilience embedded in all of our communities, opposed to just looking at communities as here's the different scarcities or deficiencies that they hold, but not recognizing that actually there's a lot of power and there's a lot of joy in the communities in which we are working as well. So for the agenda for today, because the sad part is that we are literally 17 minutes in, that was just my intro. So I'm going to move quicker, but not too quick, so that, again, accessibility wise, we can make sure everyone understands what I am describing. So the agenda for today is we will go over some quick definitions in language, because language setting is key. We will briefly go over our introduction to equity-centered community design framework. I will note that our equity-centered community design framework, we actually created a field guide that was open sourced. So if you go to creativereactionlab.com, you can download that. You also can attend one of our webinars, which is called Introduction to Equity-Centered Community Design, which is 90 minutes to 2 hours long, where it will dive deeper and have you think about application as well. And that webinar also is free if that's something you're looking for. I will go over our Redesigners for Justice movement and really have you start to think about how do I leverage my power and access on behalf of folks that have the living expertise, and how do I actually leverage my living expertise when I am showing up in spaces that I want to change. And then lastly, leave you some tips that I've learned when we are looking at how do we shift our minds when we're trying to show up in these spaces, and understanding that unlearning is a key part of that, not just learning, but unlearning is a key part of that, especially when we want to sustain in the purpose, not in the work, but in the purpose. So going on to language setting. The first thing I would note that language setting is the first step in any community and equity-centered work. If we cannot co-create a foundation of language and definitions together, how are we going to be able to expect to co-create interventions together? Unfortunately, there tends to be this assumption that my definition that I hold must be the exact same definition that someone else's hold. But we need to recognize that we all have different living expertise. We all have different perspectives. We all have different backgrounds. And so we may be saying the exact same thing, but differently. And so we actually start everything with language setting to really set that nice grounding. In our longer form programs with our young leaders, we actually co-create definitions together. So our community design apprenticeship program that we did in 2020, where they were working towards food justice, they actually came up with their own definitions of healthy food. They came up with their own definitions of food deserts that they later changed to food apartheids. And they came up with their own definition of food justice. And so if you don't take anything from this today, if you're like, oh, that sounds nice, this is the one piece I believe that you need to remember more than anything, because you'll be surprised how much language is the first barrier for us to actually co-create and engage with one another. So I'm going to first just give you framing, because I've used this term a few times. You probably heard it several times, but I want to let you understand what I mean when I say equity. When we talk about equity at Creative Reaction Lab, we talk about when outcomes are not predictable based on someone's identity. And so when we say racial equity, we are talking about when outcomes are not predictable based on someone's race. For example, in St. Louis, Missouri, in the United States, there is an 18-year life expectancy gap between affluent white residents and low-income or underinvested Black residents. 18 years. That is a predictable outcome that we should not be able to say or have. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation found that every 7 minutes, a Black person dies prematurely due to the effects of racial discrimination. Every 7 minutes. Again, that is the actual predictable data point that we should not have. And yet we unfortunately do when we look at all of the racial identities. And it's something that when we talk about equity, it's not as easy as let's just change a policy, but we are ultimately looking at let's change continual intersecting systems that is very complex and messy. Because it's not enough to just say, I'm going to improve this system for Korean Americans, for example, and not also look at the reality that there are able-bodied Korean Americans. There's also differently able-bodied Korean Americans. There's also different classes that come into play. There's also different sexual orientation. And unfortunately, across a lot of our identity groups, there are many disparities that prohibit us from having a longer life expectancy and quality of life. This is the image that the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation produced. Some of you all may have seen a version of this where it's children trying to look over a fence or people standing on boxes trying to get fruit from a tree. There's many different ways to show up or present this. I want to just break it down easily. Equality is giving folks equal access. Equity is giving people equal outcomes. And we should not think that they are interchangeable, even though I've seen it being interchanged in many spaces. Giving someone access is not the same as someone having the same outcomes. And so we have to be very mindful of that we can't just say, well, I created blank, so of course it should be fine. And recognizing that it's not just what you've created, but what is the actual impact of what was created? And did it actually give folks the opportunity for equal outcomes, right? Also, when I say design, this is what I meant earlier when I said my definition has changed. When I was studying design in school, I remember my teacher clearly saying to me that she could not give me the definition of design, but she would tell me that Apple and the Mac was a Bible. Now, there's many things we can unpack on that was problematic about that statement, because it showed that we were more reliant on tech, which I view as ivory towers, versus the actual purpose of design. In the 1960s, IBM defined design as the intent behind an outcome. However, at Creative Reaction Lab, we have expanded that definition to say that design is not just about intent, but it is also about the unintentional impact behind an outcome. Because we cannot continually equate intent and impact, because I personally believe that has been used to avoid accountability when harm and trauma has been created, because we tend to hide behind intentions. But we need to look at the actual impact of an outcome. But when you look at the definition of equity, which is, again, looking at equal outcomes, and you look at design, which is the intent and unintentional impact behind the outcome, you actually start to see the interconnection that was always there that maybe we didn't intentionally, I don't know if I want to use that word, but we never actually brought together in a strategic way for improvement. The National Equity Project talks about how any system produces what it was designed to produce. And I want to bring that up because some folks like to say Creative Action Lab. They like to change our name, but there's an intentionality of our name being Creative Reaction Lab, because there is a belief, our belief, that the role of history is always present and that you are never actually just acting without there being historical context in play. And so when we talk about systems producing what we are engaging every single day, it's because there were active decisions, there were active designs that led to what we are navigating in our own communities. And in some cases, we actually have been the actors in those spaces that have perpetuated those narratives and those spaces of harm. And so when you recognize things being producing what it was designed to produce, you actually also start to recognize the responsibility and accountability that you have as an individual to actually change these systems. So why should this way of thinking matter to you? I don't know if you realize this yet, but in addition to me having designer in my bio, you need to add it to yours as well. You all have the power to affect outcomes. You all have the design capabilities to actually improve outcomes, not only for yourself, but also for the communities that you navigate every single day. With that in mind, that means that If systems of oppression, because if all systems have been by design, if systems of oppression, inequalities, and inequities are by design, that means they can also be redesigned. We do not have to just live through life passively and say, well, it's always been that way. I don't personally subscribe to that. That's nice. The people that say it's always been that way are the folks that are more likely in the centered power position, and they just don't want to give up their privilege and power to change it for the benefit of others. And so we need to actually challenge that type of narrative. I even challenge narratives like common sense. Common according to whom? There is literally a centered power group when we use those terminologies. And also, it is created to take away from our power that we can actually redesign. But I want to challenge you that human-centered approaches are not enough, because unfortunately, I'm not saying in all cases, but in a good amount of cases, humanity has been regulated down to what I sometimes view as a cartoon strip. We pretend that we are looking at one frame of folks and not recognizing that there are things that have happened that day, things that have happened 3 years ago that might be showing up with folks in that space. Also, generational occurrences that are showing up with folks in the space. And to think that we're only going to look at humanity through this very narrow, what is in front of me lens, that in itself is a form of erasure, and it contributes to harm. But I also want to challenge us to know that empathy alone is not enough to shift power and redesign systems. Because if you have not been actually building your own humility to actually become empathetic, empathy is ultimately still about you. Empathy is still about your agenda. Empathy is still, in many cases, paternalistic versus you really reflecting on what are my biases, what are my unseen areas, how have I actually used my privilege not only to help but potentially harm, and recognizing that it has to be hand in hand and not only empathetic. And so I know there's a huge empathy movement that has been happening for the past decade and more, but I tend to challenge that because there tends to be this lack of vulnerability, there tends to be this lack of transparency and this lack of accountability to actually allow folks to become more empathetic. Because if I haven't challenged my biases around a certain identifying group, how can I actually become empathetic to what they are actually dealing with? We have to really build the humility piece into the process. Erica Hart, a sexuality educator, writer, activist. Please follow them on all forms of social media. I love them. They are amazing. They said that empathy does not guarantee or assure that someone is going to care enough to do something, especially if they need a framework or a word to do it. So if someone's like, I am just going to be an empathy guru, I have questions. I really do. And I appreciate Erica really calling out that if you need that framing to actually show up in spaces, then it is not enough. And in many cases, it is performative. So moving on to introduction to equity-centered community design. There is a lot of content, not in general, but I'm just saying, it seems like we went through that quick, but I question. All right. So now going to introduction to equity-centered community design. This is the framework you saw on the screen. This is the framework that I'll be briefly going over. But as you will see here, it is not like more traditional design thinking methodologies, if you know that methodology, or more traditional like scientific methodology, believe me, I actually started as a biology major, wanted to be a biotechnology. It's a whole thing. A biotechnologist, it's a whole thing. I don't really talk about it as much, but there's many different similarities in this framework to others. But one thing we're intentional about is that there's no line. There's no, you go step by step. Hey, I checked the box. So, I'm done. Ooh, I have my Post-it notes. Hello, I have my Sharpie. It's done. Like we use them too. And, it's not enough to just look at this work and a very much one step at a time approach, but need to understand that in all of your creative problem solving process, there are elements that intersect. So when you see in this image, you see that there are two elements that we intentionally have intersecting with every single step of the creative problem solving process. The first one is history and healing. And the other one is acknowledging, dismantling, and in some cases we say shifting and sharing power constructs. We recognize that history, we recognize that power dynamics, and also the need to heal is along every step of the process, whether you are building your team while you're inviting diverse co-creators or you're developing evaluation metrics as you are doing testing and learning, right? And so I want to intentionally name the strategic approach to the design of this imagery, because there's no one starting point. And also those two areas that I named intersect across every single step of the process. So first I'll go through history and healing. We need to understand that there is a history around any topic, around any community, around even the identities of the groups that we are engaging with and also we are a part of when we show up in spaces. And it is not enough to just say, oh, I'm addressing, for instance, public transportation, and not also look at how has public transportation intersected with the racist policies within a specific geographic neighborhood that has had a lot of white flight, potentially also gentrification, maybe racial riots, etc., in a community. It is not enough to just say public transportation, but we really need to think about the role of history there. Because I've been in spaces where literally St. Louis, Missouri loves reports, but I've been at tables when they say, we need to do a research study, a report around how to make a more resilient city. And I love this one woman that usually is at the table. She's an older Black woman. And she every time will call them out and say, we actually already did a report on that. That happened around 17 years ago. And here's what occurred with that report. Nothing. Right? And what I appreciate about her and others like her is that they hold our feet to the fire and say, we can't erase that history. We can't erase what has already occurred. And we can't also ignore how the mistreatment or the exclusion or the intentional erasure has not led to how folks are showing up in spaces. And so, for instance, when it came to the murder of my brother, when most people learn about it, depending on the community, I've had folks come to me and say, well, I hope that person that killed him, they are under the jail, right? What they don't realize are two things. One, my brother was 14. This was a 13-year-old boy that shot my brother. And the 13-year-old boy, he shot my brother based on reports that I learned over an iPhone in my brother's bedroom. And most people hear that and say, he needs to be under jail, it's his family's fault, et cetera, et cetera. But when my brother passed, I wrote a very short Medium article that said, systems of gun violence is by design. Because I also asked the question, what different constructs and policies and decisions and designs were created that actually led to this young boy feeling that it was so worth shooting my brother over an iPhone. It wasn't enough to just say he had individual acts. And I'm not taking responsibility from him. But again, 13, remember what you were doing at 13 years old. But also looking at the reality that there were systems imposed on him and my brother that led to the outcome that we are navigating and will navigate for the rest of our lives, right? And so this type of reality is something we have to constantly think about when we're doing this work. And so some of the questions that we tell you to consider at this step of the process, it's really thinking about what has been the impact on the community by similar projects in the past, and how do we know? Is the project healing for the people and communities impacted, or does it create or recreate trauma? How do we know? And this, again, every step of the process, constantly thinking about history, constantly thinking about healing and designing that in your actual engagement and in your intervention. Next, we have acknowledging, dismantling, and shifting power constructs. power dynamics show up in every space. There's power dynamics right now. I'm the one on the mic. I have my screen on. You can see my face. So automatically there's power dynamics. Now you of course also have your own power, and you can leave anytime that you want. Please don't. Okay? But if you want to, you have that agency, you have that power. And so it surprises me when I show up in project spaces when folks say, well, I don't have any power. I've actually engaged with individuals at top design firms that literally have said, oh, I don't have power, even though they were a senior vice president. And that same person that said that is now the CEO of this very large company. And I'm like, how do you not recognize that? Yes, there are title power, but there's also power in our agency and how we show up. And the power dynamics are always going to be in play. It could be in your personality type. You could be introvert, ambivert, extrovert. It could be in, the spaces that you're in. Has the space actually been set up where people that are differently abled, and I mean that across the spectrum from able-bodied to maybe having physical disabilities or maybe neurodiverse, has the space been set up for them to 100% be able to show up and also not be criticized and judged on how they show up, right? Like power dynamics is everywhere. Unfortunately, even the clothes that we wear, as we know, the power of fashion, that also gives people a sense of power or takes it away. I have recognized that I've been treated differently in spaces when I was dressed down versus when I was dressed up. Hence why Creative Reaction Lab has our clothing policy or dress code or whatever they call them. I tell them is trendy casual, do whatever you want. I don't really care, because I've been in environments where you were expected to wear suits or chic dresses because that depicted a certain imagery. And it has seeped so much in our value of people that even my young little nephew, he's my godson, my family member actually dressed him in these like polo shirts and these little polo shorts. He's one. And I'm like, why is he dressing this way? Like, why does he look like he's about to go to a country club? I'm confused. And she said to me, well, I'm dressing him for his future position. I'm like, well, what is his future position? She's like, a CEO. And I looked at her and I said, am I not a CEO? And she immediately got challenged. And she was like, I hadn't thought of that. Because there was a narrative that was centered in her life that white men, polo shirts, etc., were CEOs. And that's how she needed to actually dress her son. That's one, for that future role, opposed to actually challenging that and how we show up. Like, I'm wearing a t-shirt with some fabulous earrings, by the way, okay? And I'm no less than a CEO than that person that's showing up in that suit. I was just getting an award on Monday, just like that person might be getting an award as well. So how do we recognize that power dynamics show up everywhere, and unfortunately has been seeped in us also since birth? So questions to consider: who should have power in this project and why? Who actually has power in this project and why? Does the distribution of power in the project reflect the community impacted by the project? If not, why not? Next, we have inviting diverse co-creators. Very short. Folks in the room need to actually be the living expert on the issue. They should be not research subjects. I hate the term beneficiaries, but they are actual co-owners, co-creators of it. We need to recognize the different identities and perspectives that we bring in spaces, and we should not be only centering certain identities and perspectives because they have been more traditionally put in position of power and privilege, but really recognize the power that we hold as the living experts of an issue. And so when you're inviting diverse co-creators and actually building out your project or your program or your program team, or honestly your own personal advisory group or just groups of friends, you want to think also who is part of the decision-making table and why. Not who can give me insight, because there's a difference from being a research subject versus being a decision maker. So who's actually part of the decision-making table and why? Who is missing from the decision-making table and why? And how can we make decision-making spaces more accessible to people who want and need to be involved? A few years ago, I was on a panel at Harvard, and it was the first time I've ever been to Harvard, because in my neighborhood, like Harvard was like high up there that you wanted to attend. Really, but now my brain's like, I now challenge a lot of like university systems, how they were built on the backs of Black folks and people of color. And we don't really talk about that enough. But I was on a panel at Harvard a few years ago, and one of my panelists actually said, I personally believe that the people that should be in the room are in the room. And I was like, oh, no, ma'am. Like, I've kind of gotten a reputation for calling people out. I don't really care the situation. And that was definitely one of those moments, because that had a very privileged and exclusionary mindset to me. And let me be clear that this was a Black woman. Like, most people think that it's only, white men or white women. But I want to note that the systems of white supremacy is embedded, unfortunately, in our culture and society globally, that we are all navigating every day. And that part of our work is continually unlearning that in how we show up. And so it is not just white folks perpetuating white supremacy, but even through the lens of assimilation and conformity that a lot of communities of color have had to do to survive in their country and in their society, have led to them upholding those same standards that actually create harm for them, right? So in that panel, I had to call that out and say, that is not okay. That is not actually true. There are actual barriers of power sharing, and there's barriers of access that we have to think about when we are designing the invitation to actually engage and work with one another. There could be barriers like transportation, technology, language accessibility, childcare access, the time of day engagements are happening. Are they being paid for their time just like you're being paid for your time? And I've had folks say, well, how do you do that? Just like you're writing a budget, your paycheck, you can write in the budget, their paycheck. And at our organization, in every line item, every budget, we actually have a line item called the Living Expert Stipend. Okay, so all of that needs to be there. Okay, I promise you, I'm gonna move it. I'm gonna keep it moving. Okay, so I already went over building humility and empathy a little earlier when I went on my little tangent. Okay, so questions to consider here. What assumptions and biases do I have about the people and communities whom this project impacts? What assumptions have we built into our metrics of success? We also, again, I spoke to this a little bit in history and healing, need to look at the intersection of different topics and community needs when we are defining the problem at hand that we're looking to address. Questions to consider: what local issues matter most to community members, and how is this integrated into the project? What do community members want to see as a result of this project? And who is the audience of focus and why? More times than not, and I would even argue unintentionally, our audience of focus, while we may say on paper is one group, we also are still designing through the narrative of another, particularly the ones that are centered. And so really thinking through, how do we define the audience of focus, even beyond just, I'm just going to use myself as an example, a Black woman. Okay, being Black and being a woman is not a monolith. Okay, being trans and being indigenous of different tribes is not a monolith. Like, there's many different intersections for us. And so being very specific of even thinking about one's interests, one's values, personality types, like what are some of the barriers they're navigating? All of that goes into defining the audience of focus. Ideating approaches most people know about, but in short and very simply, because I think this is very design professional, quote unquote, even though I challenge the word professional language, brainstorming. It's the easiest way to say it. Brainstorming different ideas. I tell people all the time, it's like a brain purge. It's usually starting off with not saying no, but then as time goes on, as you defined your audience, as you defined your community and topic of focus and really the problem framing, it's not that it becomes a no, it becomes a, How, like, does this actually meet the needs of the community? Does it meet the needs of the audience of focus? Is it actually addressing the issue? So it's not a no, it's a, is it actually applicable to what we're looking to do? And in some cases, the other question that really needs to be asked is, what are the unintended consequences of the idea that is being created? And I would even argue, what's the intended consequences? So when every project that we do within our different learning engagements, that is one of the key questions that we ask, which is around the unintended consequences. And it's not enough to just think about how will it be applied, but how will actually maybe the lack of sustainability or the lack of ownership in the community lead to more harm in the community? So questions to consider: does our ideation process include diverse stakeholders? If not, why not? But again, if you did inviting diverse co-creators, then the ideation process would already include diverse stakeholders. How do ideas build on existing resources? A colleague of mine that does a lot of great community engagement work in the city of Detroit, Michigan, in the United States. Actually, I love a talk she gave a few years ago where she said, Detroit is not a blank canvas. And what I love about this is that you can apply any city, any rural area, anything. Like, it is not a blank canvas, right? Like, and in her city in particular, there are many folks with very paternalistic mindsets coming into the space and saying, we're going to build a new city. We're going to reimagine Detroit. And she's looking around like, we're here. So who are you designing for? There's already resources here. And so I challenge you all to think about, how do I build upon existing resources? How do I build upon assets that are already there and recognize the power and the greatness of those assets? And then how are we determining the viability of ideas, and is the process equitable? Rapid prototyping is building your ideas out as quickly, I would say, I don't want to say quickly, because sense of urgency is also a white supremacy tenet, but it's testing it out and building it out, opposed to just living in your head, and really building out around the different assumptions that you're looking to test around the idea, opposed to investing a lot of time, resources, funding, which could be used for something else, by the way, then for you to present it to a community, which you shouldn't be doing. But let's say, go for the sake of most process, presenting in the community, and then they say, that's cute, and you just received all these millions of dollars so that you can put it on your resume and win a whole bunch of awards for something that actually is not even utilized by the community, nor do they want it. So rapid prototyping allows you to test earlier. It allows you to really build. I believe in learning by making and by doing. And it helps you move out of your head, but really brings it tangibly to life. And prototyping could be along fidelity and the spectrum of that to low to high. It could be along functionality and the spectrum of that low to high. It also could be around the flexibility of the prototype and the spectrum of that low to high, okay? So questions to consider: does our prototyping process include diverse stakeholders? If not, why not? How transparent is the prototyping process? Are you prototyping behind closed door as opposed to actually co-designing prototypes with the community? And then how are we determining the success of the prototypes? Did the community actually define the success metrics of your intervention? Or do you already have your agenda and therefore that's what you're building it off of? Testing and learning. Testing and learning should be embedded across the process. Most people think about evaluation of a project after it's already launched. I personally believe, and we personally believe at Creative Reaction Lab, that testing and learning is every step of the process, right? So when you are thinking about the research you're conducting in a community, again, with diverse co-creators, that you're learning from that experience. When you're developing your evaluation metrics or co-creating how success is defined, you are learning from that experience. When you're building prototypes, you're learning from that experience. Even when you're inviting diverse co-creators and you all are learning how to navigate each other as team members, you are learning in that experience. And so testing and learning is across the process. And it should not just be, okay, did we get feedback on the prototype at the end? So questions to consider: how, where, and from whom are we gathering feedback and why? Are you only doing town halls for feedback? One, no one wants to come to those. Like, just saying, if I had a choice between a town hall and something else, I'm probably not going to go to a town hall. But from how, where, and from whom are you gathering feedback, and why? Are you only talking to folks that have the same or similar lived experience to you, or folks that you know are going to say yes? And then actually like only and exclude the folks that actually will challenge it for actually improving. If so, you need to challenge some things on your own structure. Also, how do we make sure that we genuinely incorporate the feedback as we gather, as we iterate, and whose input are we still missing? Because testing and learning never ends. There's not we talk to two people and we're good. It's like people are always going to come and find space for improvement, as they should. Every year, every semester, every day of a program, we are learning how to modify and improve it based on feedback. And that should be built in your structure. So here's some examples of a program I mentioned earlier, which is the Community Design Apprenticeship Program. So the Community Design Apprenticeship Program is one of our programs. We have several, but we have 5 particular youth programs. But the Community Design Apprenticeship Program is a program where we work with formerly incarcerated and criminal justice system impacted Black and Latinx youth to actually come up with their own interventions around a hyper-local racial and health inequity in their own community. This program is only in St. Louis. We've had young people applying from different parts of the country. It's like, but it's only in St. Louis. It is only like accessible to St. Louis youth. All of our other programs are actually national, or in some cases international. This one, we believe in scaling through depth and not just scaling through breadth. And I want to make sure you think about that scale, it is not just how many people are we reaching, but it's also how deep are we engaging in the community. And so the 2018 program was looking at public transportation access and how this large multi-billion-dollar investment in the community to our light rail system could impact quality of life of a city neighborhood. Also, our 2020 program, because 2019 we spent the time to reflect, to improve, because 2018 was our pilot. The 2020 program was the program I was just speaking about, looking at food apartheid, and they directly was looking at how do we address the reality that there are 2 neighborhoods in the St. Louis Promise Zone that do not have accessibility to an actual grocery store and to healthy foods, again, based on how they define healthy food. And they found that there were residents that were very dejected. They found that there were residents that actually said, it's not that I don't have public transportation, but there's a sense of shame in using food stamps at a whole food market, right? And so there was a lot of different ways they could go about it. They ultimately ended up creating what they called the blessed and highly flavored food boxes, where they had co-created recipes, healthy food recipes from the community. They had explored the different recipes and the different food that would be in these boxes based on the residents' input themselves. So these completely changed from where they started at the beginning, and really was looking at how do we meet people where they are. And so that was the 2020 program. And the 2021 program that's coming up, actually launching in July, they are directly looking at how gun violence impacts community health, community trauma and mental health within another St. Louis Promise Zone neighborhood. And I want to note that the topics that we are naming, the young leaders from the previous cohort actually select the topic. Okay, so that is literally the flow that we actually have in our program. Like, again, shifting power, they determine where we're going next. They determine what the topic of focus will be. Like, they are a part of that process. And Robert, the person you see on the right hand side of this photo, we actually hired him. We have a program called the Community Organizing and Healing Resident position. where we have a former apprentice come and work with us full time on that program, and also thinking about how we can integrate healing practices more intentionally in our curriculum. And so Robert is our current community organizing and healing resident. So reflection for you, and it's something I want you to think about. What opportunities do you see to be more intentional about centering equity in your design processing? Okay, the processes, excuse me. This is a question I really want you to think about, and I encourage you, take a screenshot of this. My understanding, we also be sharing this deck, I believe, but take a screenshot and make this a journaling prompt for you. And when I say journaling, it could be where you're actually writing. It could be where you're, doing audio recording, you're speaking in video, you want to create an art piece around it. So journaling does not just have to be written word. I want to name that, but really think about how are you centering equity in your design processes. Also, food for thought that I want you to reflect on is what are our roles and responsibilities in redesigning for justice, okay? So I promise you, I'm gonna go maybe 10 more minutes. Hear me out, right? I feel like we started a little late anyway, so just let me have that, all right? So 10 more minutes, and then I will be open to all the questions you all have. Okay. All right, so Redesigners for Justice. I will move a little bit quicker. Veronica, if it becomes a mess or something, just do like a Margasa, and I will slow it down for you, please, okay? All right, so we are mobilizing a new type of leader that we call Redesigners for Justice. We are challenging the mindset that people should just be social change makers, because I'm gonna be honest, it's very easy to say that you're a change maker. Did I change something? Yes. All righty then, I'm a change maker. Whereas being a redesigner for justice, we actually have tenets around that of intentionality, of thinking about how we are showing up in spaces. We believe that those who are most directly impacted by inequities are also closest to approaches to address them. If you know anything about Brian Stevenson's work, he talks about proximity, and we very much believe the exact same thing. When we talk about redesigning for justice, we view it as a coin. And so on one end, we call them equity designers, and on another end, we call them design allies. These are not different people, okay? And this is not a job title. If I see this putting out anywhere, like we're looking to hire a redesigner for justice to join our team, I have questions, and we're about to have a conversation, because this is not a job title, this is a mindset. And so equity designer, when you're in an equity designer mindset, you are thinking about your living expertise and you are applying it. So you're putting people and racial and ethnic equity first. You're embedded in the community you're working to change. You're constantly iterating, making, and improving on intervention. And again, I mentioned earlier, building upon existing resources. But the important thing to note here is that you have the lived experience with the actual inequity that you're looking to address. This is not a paternalistic viewpoint. You are coming from your own knowledge base of what you're looking to address versus I read this in a book, okay? I want to highlight Will, that stated that I am a redesigner for justice, for social justice, mental well-being, and cannabis equity for the LGBTQIA plus communities of color, because they are all interlinked issues that I've experienced personally and professionally as a second generation Filipinx queerative living with the societal constructs of America. Will is very intentionally speaking to their lived experience, and this is why they are addressing it firsthand, because they know what this reality is. Also, Tyler said, I am a redesigner for justice, for reproductive justice, because I believe that reproductive justice encompasses all the movements for social equity and fairness that I believe in. Reproductive justice to me includes the right to bodily autonomy, safe and affirming healthcare, safety in childbirth, and participating in a community that sees, hears, loves, and supports you wholly, right? Tyler, again, speaking from their own lived experience, and that's why they're showing up in the way that they are showing up. But we recognize it is not just the work of the individuals that have been impacted by the systems to reimagine and redesign the system. That is irresponsible. That is just foolery. And that's something we intentionally talk to groups about, and saying it is not just the folks that are quote unquote targeted, even though I don't like that word, to do this work. It is also the folks that actually have been privileged by these oppressive systems that need to actually work to dismantle them. And so allyship is key to supporting and amplifying equity designers. And I know there's also a very intentional movement challenging the word ally because it's very passive. And so for us, we actually say our folks, the other side of the coin, are design allies, because being an ally can be very passive. Did I post a black box on social media? Oh, I did. Wonderful. I did my job. Right? Whereas being a design ally has a very similar requirement as an equity designer. Like, you're still putting people, racial and ethnic equity first. You're still building upon existing resources, et cetera. But you're particularly more so not centering your living expertise, but leveraging your power and access on behalf of the folks that do have the living expertise, and really recognizing the role that you play. And I want to note that leveraging power, I would even in some cases argue risking power, depending on the context, and really thinking about what am I willing to provide and or give up for something that I truly believe in, which are the folks with living expertise. So Alicia said that I am a redesigner for justice, for racial justice, environmental justice, disability justice, and LGBTQ justice. I grew up realizing these were problems all around me, and I didn't want to sit back while decisions were made that affected whole communities. I want to stand up for those who cannot. You also need to remember that you could be an equity designer in one context and a design ally in another. I am an equity designer when it comes to being the survivor of gun violence. I'm an equity designer for Black women. I am an equity designer for women that are able-bodied, but also have chronic illnesses like Crohn's disease, right? But I cannot be an equity designer for LGBTQIA plus community. I can be a design ally, and that's what I am. And so it's being very understanding of in what spaces are you leveraging your power and access, and in what spaces are you leveraging your actual living expertise. Okay. And so you need both to actually have equitable outcomes. It's not one or the other. You need both to actually get us to the space that we are working towards. And so in our work of youth engagement, we talk about all the time, while our mission is youth engagement, we are building an intergenerational movement of redesigner for justice. Our work that we do is not just with young people. We actually, again, open source our framework for anyone, because we recognize it's not one organization, one individual, or one group that's going to get us to an equitable society. And how dare we think that we can go into someone else's community and tell them what they need to do to actually design equity, opposed to the community doing it themselves and understanding that they have that power to do it. But we also actually do engagement with adults through our webinar series. We also we work with institutional clients. We provide individual and institutional coaching, because again, this work is intergenerational. And for us, when we're talking about equitable outcomes, we are looking at it through the lens of race and ethnicity, and we're also about looking at it through the lens of ages. And so that is something that we intentionally think about. How are we creating spaces where different groups are able to show up and co-create together? And so lastly, I'm gonna finish with the just quick tips, and I'm going to read them. I'm not gonna expand upon them. I can answer the questions if there are any questions around the tips that I'm stating. But I wanna remind folks that we are not looking for process adoption, but a mindset shift. We are not, when we talk about equities in the community design, when we talk about redesigning for justice, I am not looking for folks to walk around with a clipboard and say, did I do this? Check. I am looking for folks to continually unlearn and challenge their perspectives, to think about, how do I shift my mindset where when I show up in a space, I'm able to not only notice the inequities, I also notice this sense of joy and the acts of resiliency. And I also am able to think about, who am I able to co-create with to actually address these issues, or in some spaces that I show up in, recognizing that I should not actually be leading, and I shouldn't come in and say, here's what we need to change, without first being embedded in the community and learning if change needs to actually happen. So lastly, mindset shift. Very quick tips. First mindset shift should be around dismantling power constructs. You need to understand your power to design perspectives and outcomes. You need to examine and challenge narratives of quote unquote leadership in self and others. You also need to identify and intentionally shift power dynamics away from the status quo. And the status quo is different depending on the identities in which you are actually centering in that space. You also need to have a mindset shift around healing, understanding that healing is central to claiming our power. If we're not creating space for healing, how do we create space for actual reimagining? Healing is a part of reimagination. We also need to set boundaries to take care of yourself in the ways that work for you. Create spaces that respect and value self inquiry and self determination, and value the act of building trust and removing agendas. A lot of the colleagues that I have that are doing more intentional community organizing work talk about how they build at the speed of trust. And that is something that I encourage you all to think about as well. We include the screenshot of me here because last year, as we know, George Floyd was murdered, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, like there were so many Black people that were murdered, and we are seeing now the continuation of what's happening globally for different identifying groups, not just Black groups, but also what's happening in Colombia, what's happening in Israel and Palestine, what's happening like to Asian groups and the hate crimes that they are dealing with. And I know the government level just now having a policy to protect them. And so there's a lot happening, and it's easy to be overwhelmed. And you can see in this photo, in this, it's a screenshot, I was looking a little busted. Okay. And that because at that time, and as you can see, it was May 30th, it was actually pretty much the closing of one of the hardest months that I have a year, because May is the month again that my brother was murdered. It's also his birthday month. My brother was a twin, and so his twin, also we have to celebrate her at the same time of remembering him. There's also the month that I lost my uncle 6 years ago due to a lot. Let me just put it that way. So that was a hard month. And yet I showed up in that space. It was a short video and saying silence doesn't help anyone. And I know we're exhausted, but we need to think about how we show up for one another. And then also at the same time, make sure we create space for ourselves for healing and create space for ourselves for stepping away. I actually hadn't really posted much that month. And so it was after that time frame that I was able to come back, because I took that space for healing for myself and my family. And I encourage you to always think about that yourself. Another mindset shift we have is building humility. Acknowledge that you're on a journey and learning acknowledge that you're on a journey and learning while doing. And so is everyone else. We don't have an equitable society. We have spaces of individual liberation, but we also need to remember that we are working towards collective liberation. And so we are all learning while doing this, and it's messy and it's hard and you're going to make mistakes, and that's completely normal. And so have grace on yourself, and then also have grace for others as they're on a journey. I've had someone say to me that I tend to be very curious for equity. I've literally been in Ubers back when we traveled a lot, and actually that was before I went to Lyft because of what was Uber doing, but where literally I've had to have conversation with folks that wanted to very much tell me how much they were proponents of gun rights before they even knew my background. And so I wasn't angry with them. We had a conversation of questions and sharing our perspective, and actually left that space respecting each other more, even though we may not have agreed on everything. We still saw each other as human, opposed to just the issue at hand. And so that's something we need to be very mindful of. Don't design in ivory towers, but live and immerse yourself on the ground, and know that your phone and your computer can be an ivory tower. Make sure you put a mirror up to your oneself to make sure you're not performative, but also working lifelong in this work. And then lastly, your mindset shift of nurturing equity-centered culture. Make sure you're appreciating and amplifying living expertise equally, if not more than professional expertise. I personally don't care about the letters behind your name. Sorry, I know a lot of folks, they work hard for those letters, and I'm not saying you don't deserve it. I'm just saying I will not put the letters behind someone else's name above the living expertise of someone. I just won't do it. Equity is messy and complex, and we've never had it, so learn while doing. Allocate resources, time, finances, power, etc., to build our equitable systems. And again, as stated earlier, unlearn and relearn. And so I'm going to leave you all with my Redesigners for Justice pledge. And I encourage you all to come up with your own pledge on how you're going to be a redesigner for justice. I said that my mission in life is to be a redesigner for justice, to really think about how we acknowledge that all of our systems have been by design and that they also can be redesigned, and not just be a person that passively moves through life, but understand that I have a role or responsibility and a space for accountability to really push for change. I am a person that centers racial equity and health equity in all of my work. And so I want you all to think about, how are you centering racial equity, health equity? It could be ability equity, it could be equity in the fashion space, it could be environmental justice, climate change, everything. How are you centering that in your purpose? And share it with us at Creative Reaction Lab, because we're always happy to share people's pledge, and always happy to see how people are doing this work. So thank you again. You can connect with me here. And I see your request to go back to the slide. Jess, are you trying to get a screenshot? If so, let me know. Do your thing. So I have two, and I'm going to answer them very quickly.
Okay, go
Carroll said, how important is imagination and creativity when carrying out equity design work? You cannot get to the space of equity without imagination and creativity. It's not even possible, because we've never had equity. When you're talking about a world where outcomes are not predictable based on any identity, that means that we have to imagine it. We've never had that. And so I tell people all the time, like, when there's also judgment in the equity space, or they're only focusing on bias training, it's like, we need a whole new world that we have not even imagined. And so we need that creativity. And it's not, and we also need to challenge the way we approach problems, where it's not a mentality of let's have a 2 + 2 = 4 approach, but what equals 4 approach. Because when you ask the question, what equals 4, you recognize there are a variety of different ways you can get to the number 4. Versus when you say 2 + 2 = this, then that only has one approach. And so creativity and imagination is key to all of that. And then the last question I want to add, and it's not one where I'll be able to go deep into it, but I felt like I at least wanted to bring it into this space because I think it's such a great question. It says, thank you for this amazing class, Antionette. I want to know your opinion on what do you say to people who use healing as a way to stay in power. They often want to direct people to healing as a way to stop people from dismantling power constructs. The short way of me answering that is, dismantling power constructs is key to my healing. Okay, and you cannot define what healing means for me. I have literally pushed back on people when they have said to me, you should have, you don't really uphold self-care. I've been in trauma and responsive training where we were looking at self-care, and they asked who feels that they actually, have self-care. And I raised my hand, and the facilitator was like, Antionette, you don't have self-care. And I was hot. They should have picked, he picked the wrong one that day. I was hot because I'm like, you realize this list you just gave us, light a candle, right? Color some pages. And those are important to self-care for many people, but you cannot define what self-care means for me. And that is actually judgment. And so it's the same when it comes to healing. You cannot define what is healing for me. That is not a possibility. I define that myself, and that definition has the right to continually change over time as I continually change over time. And so actually dismantling power constructs for my life is a form of healing, because I recognize that legacy building is something that has been taken away from my family as Black people, where I don't even know my ancestors. And a fear that I have is that my doggone family 100, 200 years from now would not know who we are and what we've done because of the systems that are in place. And so my healing is legacy building. My healing is challenging these power dynamics in these systems so that I can have legacy building in my family. And so challenge that pushback and say, just by nature of you asking that question, that shows that you are trying to put your perspective on my journey. And that in itself is problematic and leads to more trauma and harm. So that's what I'm gonna close with today. I appreciate you all. And thank you so much for having me.
Oh my God, I'm screaming. I'm just taking notes. I'm freaking out. Thank you so much. Thank you. We are so indebted to you. So grateful. There's no words I can express. I am so humbled. I am so grateful. Thank you. And thank you to the Creative
Reaction Lab. Yep, we got you.
I'm like, I can't speak. Thank you for helping me on that one. Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you, Veronica. And thank you to the amazing audience that we had today. Any last words? And then we're going to go on vacation for 3 days with a long weekend.
I know. If you're talking about me, last word I have for you all is you are enough, and that you're on that journey, and take care of yourself in the way that works for you. So just thank you for being you, and thank you for being on this journey of life with all of us, because that's what we're all doing. Other than that, thank you.